So, since Dune Part 2 has come out, we have seen the whole world fall in love with this movie. Both the casual movie-going audience, who's been really impressed by the characters, the world, and all these things, and also the film people who love it for all its technical achievements and for its filmmaking craft at the hands of Denis Villeneuve. You have the casual and the hardcore camps who converge into their mutual appreciation for this one movie, which doesn't happen very much, so shout out. And when compared to Dune Part 1, you will hear many people say that this is better than Part 1 significantly, and even people looking back on Part 1 are now saying it's just simply not as good, or even first-time viewers, they found it boring and not as memorable, and now all of a sudden this Dune Part 2 has been this global phenomenon in a way that I don't think Dune Part 1 was, at least to this extent. Personally, I think Dune Part 1 is a perfect movie, and I think that Dune Part 2 is not a perfect movie. And ultimately, I think that is the reason why Dune Part 2 has become much bigger and been received better than Part 1. Now, I want to go back to those two camps, the casual audience and the filmmaking audience. The filmmaking audience is able to appreciate the film for its technical qualities, for its craft, for all this stuff, ultimately being able to see it from more of that critical craft kind of perspective. Whereas the casual audience is a lot more interested in the characters, the themes, the world, the story. The story itself is the main driving force for their appreciation. That this whole idea of Paul's Lisan al-Gaib arc and the Bene Gesserit and in that kind of very conceptual way, in that kind of very like emotionally resonant way, in how the characters impact our own lives, and that kind of relatability aspect to it. And so you can see that people are appreciating the film not just from the emotional perspective, but also from the more critical and filmmaking point of view. And I think it's important to realize that these two are separate things. The story is this situation that happens, and it's this fictional narrative. And the film is just the way in which the story is told. It is not the story itself. And at times, these two factors can come at odds with each other. The Empire magazine gives Dune Part 2 4 out of 5 stars. It does criticize the movie, saying the character through lines are forced to reckon with central figures who, through narrative necessity, become less human as the film progresses. And so you can see that we have this conflict between the film has to manage creating characters which are great to watch and which feel natural on screen, overall creating a good film or an enjoyable film to watch, but also those characters needing to convey the story and the themes to the audience, and they start to feel less natural. And so what I'm getting at is the balance between how watchable can you make your characters and how effectively does the story get communicated to the audience. And I think Dune Part 2 prioritizes the story over the technical craft of it. If we take a look at this dialogue scene where Gurney is questioning Paul on his decision to refrain from going into the South, it's not the greatest dialogue. It's not the most memorable dialogue. It doesn't roll off the tongue. But what it does do is really effectively communicate the Lisan al-Gaib story, that kind of grappling with fate idea, that really the story and the essence of what makes the story good. It communicates that very explicitly. So you're getting these lines like where Gurney says, what, you're scared that you'll lose control? And Paul says, no, because I gain it. You know, that's a very important idea that's central to that Lisan al-Gaib, the prophecy, the ethics, the morality of it all. But it feels like a very forced line. And so that shows that you can either have one or the other. Like, do you want naturalistic dialogue or do you want dialogue that communicates your story effectively? And as we said, the casual movie-going audience, they leave the theater thinking about, whoa, the Lisan al-Gaib, like, Paul, I didn't see that coming, and wow, the Harkonnens are so evil, and all that stuff. So we established that the story is what the casual audience is more interested in, hence why this movie has become the insane cultural phenomenon that it is, because it does prioritize getting the story across. And crucially, I think Dune Part 1 does the opposite of this. If we take a look at the scene in the graveyard on Caladan, You get really amazing dialogue in that scene about like, all I ever needed you to be is my son. It's very impactful stuff. And from memory, people who were less interested in the politics and the action and the
sci-fi shit.
Oscar Isaac's Duke Leto Atreides is one of Dune Part 1's most memorable characters. People leave the cinema thinking about the impression that he gave to us, and you get that very warm presence from him, which you don't necessarily get from a lot of the other characters, including Paul. And so at that moment, the script commits to creating a character, creating a nice scene, far more than it does to referencing the Lisan al-Gaib narrative, which is the ultimate meat and potatoes of the Dune story. We have to remember that the value and the merit of the original Dune story comes in a very intellectual way. It's a thought experiment, it's philosophical, conceptual, and in that way, it requires a lot of brain power and use of your mind to observe the whole narrative. Because all the little stories about the Harkonnens and the Bene Gesserit and the Atreides, they all structurally sit underneath the Lisan al-Gaib story. And that's kind of the most rewarding way to view that story, is if you're able to look at it from that very like historical point of view almost, and the very kind of like throwing around philosophical ideas, concepts and stuff, rather than getting emotionally invested in any of the characters. So of course this lends itself far more to a book, which is more inherently mind stimulating, than a movie, which is more casual, and that kind of the mass market aspect of filmmaking means that you attract a lot more of an emotional audience than a kind of critical, all the rest of it kind of stuff. And so then you think, which bits of the story that we see in Dune Part 2 have become cultural phenomenons? Mainly it's Feyd-Rautha or Paul's speech, these big declarations of emotion and big, acting performances or things that really connect with certain emotions. Whereas the more interesting philosophical ideas of the Bene Gesserit's politics and the Emperor do not resonate on that wavelength, but rather far more in that like broader view of how this web of stories collides to create the Dune world. You need to view it from that kind of way in order to gain an appreciation for those parts of the story. Therefore, characters like Feyd-Rautha are what has become the cultural phenomena. And ultimately, the Lisan al-Gaib story, the meat and potatoes of the actual story of Dune, is mostly contained explicitly in the events of the Dune Part 2 film. And the Dune Part 1 film doesn't get as much of the Lisan al-Gaib story. And so that kind of main story can't yet resonate with more casual audiences. And so when you get in the critical state of mind, Dune Part 1 all of a sudden reveals itself to be a better movie. It's just that it doesn't do as good of a job of including you in the story. Take this scene from Part 1. There are these lines going on where the interaction between the Sardaukar and the Bene Gesserit and the Harkonnen are playing out. And that's a very crucial moment in the plot of the story. But it's overshadowed by the stylistic filmmaking components where Denny has muted the sound and he's put it in subtitles and he's put this cone and it looks cool.
Hierarchies. I do.
Ultimately, expert filmmaking.
I do.
But there's so much going on there, especially visually. And so the plot is overshadowed in that moment. So I think Denis Villeneuve, the filmmaker, is able to channel the story through the filmmaking much better in Dune Part 1 than he is in Dune Part 2. But in Part 2, those moments of weakness in that channeling let the audience in more. And hey, even though that the Dune story is a brilliant one, as we've just established, that 1984 movie is terrible. So there we are. Dune Part 2 is a worse film than Dune Part 1, quality-wise, but that allows it to be received better and allows it to be seen and appreciated by more people. And to close this video, I'd like to make that an analogy for how we can view our own lives.
If you are technically brilliant, say you're 10 out of 10 technically brilliant. However, if your ability to communicate is a 3 out of 10, do you think people perceive you to be a 10 out of 10 or a 3 out of 10? We are only as good as we can communicate. As you improve your ability to communicate, you improve the impact that you have within your teams, you improve the impact that you can have in your personal lives. I've taught this to thousands of students, and I always see the same thing. Technically brilliant individuals not being recognized for how amazing they truly are. And it's simply because they keep telling others that, oh, I'll let my work speak for itself. Why not do both? Why not do both? We live in a society of this or that. It's not or, it's and. It's both. When you become undeniably great technically and you become undeniable with your communication skills, do you know what happens? Reality becomes negotiable. You can negotiate any reality you desire.